Orchard Road. Chapter 1. The Color of October. The Riesling caught the light the way the bay did on a clear afternoon, all gold and moving depth. And Audrey Laine had learned, in 18 months of pouring it, to let people notice that before she said a word. She watched the woman across the tasting bar lift the glass, tilt it slightly, and draw in a slow breath the way Audrey had shown the group. There were 6 of them, a bachelorette party from Grand Rapids, rosy-cheeked and cheerful, wearing matching sashes that said Bride Tribe in glittery letters. They had been easy guests, the best kind. "You'll find the stone fruit first," Audrey said, her voice settling into the warm, unhurried cadence she used in the tasting room. "Apricot, a little peach, then something crisp underneath. Green apple, maybe a hint of lime. That's the terroir speaking. The soil out here on the peninsula holds minerals that don't exist anywhere else in the state." The bride, a redhead with laugh lines just beginning at the corners of her eyes, looked up. How does it know to do that? Audrey smiled. It doesn't, really. It just responds to where it is. She had not meant that to land anywhere in particular, but it did, and she had to set the bottle down for a half-second and look at something else. The long windows, the bay beyond them, the color the water turned in late October when the light came in low and the world had gone amber and rust and the particular shade of red that only Michigan maples knew how to make. Castillo Cellars occupied a converted barn at the northern reach of the old Mission Peninsula. 18 miles of narrow land reaching into Grand Traverse Bay, like a finger tracing a line on a map. The peninsula sat precisely on the 45th parallel, halfway between the equator and the North Pole. And that geographical accident gave the land a growing season that winemakers in other parts of the country watched with something approaching envy. The cherry orchards had come first, generations back. The grapes had followed, and the tasting room, with its exposed beams and copper light fixtures and a view that made first-time visitors go genuinely quiet, had followed after that. Audrey had followed after that too, though that was a different story. "You must absolutely love working here," the bride said, gesturing at the windows with her glass, at the whole luminous afternoon arranged beyond them. Audrey paused, just a half-beat, just long enough to feel the question beneath the question. "Are you happy? Do you belong here? Does this fit you the way it looks like it should?" "I do," she said. And she meant it. That was the complicated part. She genuinely meant it. Della Okafor appeared from the back hallway at 10 minutes to 5, untying her apron and retying it in the same motion, which was a thing she did when she was restless. She was 31 and originally from Columbus and had opinions about nearly everything, most of them correct. She had taken Audrey under her wing on Audrey's first day, without making it feel like charity, which was a gift Audrey had never quite found the words to repay. "Bride Tribe?" Della said quietly, coming to stand beside her as the group migrated toward the gift shop. "Lovely, actually. They buy anything?" 2 cases of the Riesling and a bottle of the late harvest for the wedding night. Della nodded approvingly. "Confirmed lovely." She bumped Audrey's shoulder with her own. "You doing the close?" "I told Garrett Audrey stopped. Old reflex. Old name. "I told Jen I'd cover her restock. She had that thing with her kids' school." If Della noticed the stumble, she was kind enough not to show it. "I'll stay and help." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. That's why it's called helping." She disappeared toward the storage room, and Audrey heard the familiar sound of cases being moved, of bottles counted, of the ordinary end of an ordinary day. Owen Castillo came through the side door at 5:15, the way he usually did when the last guests were clearing out. He was not a tall man, but he moved through spaces as though he'd measured them, deliberate, taking in the room the way a person does when they're responsible for it and grateful for it in equal measure. His dark hair had just enough gray at the temples to suggest he'd been through something and come out the other side of it. He was 38. He did not look 38 in a way that suggested he'd been spared. He looked it in a way that suggested he'd lived it. "Good day?" he asked the room in general. "Good day," Audrey said, because Della was still in the back. He glanced at the inventory sheet on the bar, then at the shelves she'd already restocked. "You didn't have to do that." "Jen had her kids." His expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the precondition for one. He looked at her for one moment longer than necessary, the way she had noticed him doing before, and she had not yet determined whether she found it unsettling or not. She suspected the fact that she wasn't certain was itself an answer of some kind. "Thank you, Audrey." "Of course," she said, and turned back to the bottles. She drove home along the peninsula as the last of the sun fell behind the hills to the west, turning West Bay into hammered copper. The cherry orchards lined both sides of the road, stripped to their lean, dark branches now, harvest long finished, waiting with the patience of things that have been through seasons before and know another one is coming. For 3 miles she let herself feel it, the beauty of the evening, the warmth still sitting in her chest from the bride's laughter and Della's shoulder, and the way Owen had said her name. She let it be real. She let it matter. Then she turned into her apartment complex, parked, and walked upstairs with her keys in her hand and her face arranged back into the careful, composed expression she had spent 3 years perfecting. It was fine. She was fine. She was very good at fine. Chapter 2. What she brought with her. Audrey had a Saturday morning system, and she kept to it the way she kept to most things. Quietly, consistently, without making a production of it. Coffee first, while the apartment was still gray and the rest of the building was still sleeping. Then her Bible on the couch. Not always because she felt like reading it, but because she had learned that feelings were an unreliable guide to what she actually needed. Then a run if the weather allowed, and in Traverse City in October, the weather usually allowed if you were willing to layer. Then the farmer's market on Front Street if Della was free, which Della usually was on Saturdays, unless she had a reason to be otherwise. And Della generally preferred to be otherwise only under extraordinary circumstances. The apartment was small and tidy and entirely hers, which still struck Audrey sometimes as the most remarkable thing about it. A one-bedroom on the second floor of a converted Victorian on 6th Street, 12 minutes from the winery on a slow day, less on a good one. She had painted the living room a soft sage green in her second month here, rolling it on herself on a Tuesday afternoon with the windows open and the radio on. And she remembered thinking, with a clarity that was almost physical, that no one was going to tell her it was the wrong color. It was the right color. She had known it the moment she'd pulled the chip from the rack at the hardware store. She was still learning to trust that. The knowing. She had come to Traverse City 3 years ago with 2 suitcases, a box of books, and the address of her cousin, Renata's spare room in her phone. The divorce had been finalized on a Thursday in March, and by Saturday she was on US 31 heading north, watching the lower peninsula open up around her, the flat farmland giving way to rolling hills, the hills giving way to the blue suggestion of water on the horizon. And she had not cried until she saw the bay for the first time. She wasn't sure exactly why that had done it. Maybe because it was so indifferently beautiful. Maybe because it didn't know anything about her. She stayed in Renata's spare room for 6 weeks, found her footing slowly, waitressing at a downtown bistro on Union Street through the rest of that first year, grateful for the cash and the anonymity in equal measure. Found the job at Castillo Cellars through a help-wanted posting at the coffee shop next door. Found North Shore Community Church almost by accident, following a woman with kind eyes who handed her a bulletin outside the door one Sunday morning and said, "Come on in, honey, it's warm," as if she'd known Audrey was close to turning around and leaving. She had been close to turning around and leaving. Garrett had not been a man who raised his voice. That was the part that took her so long to explain, even to herself. The part that made her question her own account of what her marriage had been. He was calm, controlled. He expressed his displeasure the way some people change the temperature in a room until you couldn't quite remember what warm had felt like and had started to assume the cold was your fault. It had started small. A comment about what she'd ordered at a restaurant, a question about who she'd been texting that came out of nowhere, a silence that stretched on for 3 days after she'd accepted a promotion at work, without discussing it with him first. By the time she recognized those things for what they were, they had grown into the walls of the life she was living inside. He checked her phone. He called when she was out. He had opinions about her clothes and her friends and the way she laughed too loudly sometimes, and he delivered those opinions with such patient reasonableness that she had spent 4 years apologizing for things that needed no apology. By the end, she hadn't trusted her own instincts about anything. Not what to make for dinner, not whether she was cold, not whether she was, fundamentally, a person worthy of being in a room. She knew better now. She was still learning to feel it. Della arrived at 9:30 in a burnt orange knit hat that she had no business pulling off as well as she did. They walked to the farmer's market through air that smelled of wood smoke and cold lake water, paper cups of coffee in hand. The maple trees along 8th Street blazing overhead in colors so saturated they seemed slightly theatrical. "Nora asked about you again?" Della said, in the tone she used when she was saying something other than what she was saying. "She asks about everyone." Audrey stepped around a stroller. "Owen asks her about you?" There it was. Audrey took a sip of her coffee and looked at a display of gourds she had no interest in. "Della." "I'm just reporting facts. I'm a very factual person." "You are the least factual person I know." "Fine," Della grinned. "But you didn't say it wasn't true." Audrey didn't say anything, which Della knew better than to press. They walked in comfortable silence past a stand selling apple cider donuts, and Audrey bought 4 without needing to justify it to anyone. And the smallness of that freedom was something she still hadn't gotten over. She thought about Owen's voice saying her name the evening before, the way he'd looked at the restocked shelves and then at her, as if the connection between the two things, her effort, her presence, was worth acknowledging. She bought a bunch of sunflowers, too, just because she wanted to. Chapter 3. The Letter. The Monday morning mail at Audrey's building came early. She could hear the metal slot clap shut from her kitchen if the hallway was quiet, which it usually was before 7. She had a habit of collecting it on her way out, flipping through it on the stairs, recycling the catalogs and the coupon mailers before she even reached the landing. She almost missed it. It was sandwiched between a water bill and a furniture circular, a plain white envelope with his return address printed in the upper left corner and her name and Traverse City address, written in the careful, slightly right-leaning script she would have recognized anywhere, in any context, on any surface in the world. She knew that handwriting the way you know the sound of a door that used to open into your life. The water bill and the furniture circular fell to the floor. She didn't pick them up. She carried the letter to work unopened in the outer pocket of her bag, where she could not see it but could not stop being aware of it either. A constant, low frequency, like a sound just below the range of hearing that you feel in your back teeth. The morning was busy enough to help. A corporate group from Traverse City's downtown had booked a private tasting, Professionals in their 40s who asked good questions and lingered over the Pinot Noir, and Audrey moved through the pour sequence with the competence that came from repetition, present enough to do her job, absent enough to stay unraveled underneath it. At 12:15, she told Della she was taking lunch, took the envelope from her bag, and walked out to her car. The parking area at Castillo Cellars sat at the top of a gentle slope, and if you positioned yourself right, which Audrey did out of habit, you could see through the gap in the tree line all the way down to the East Bay, a slice of cold blue water sitting perfectly still in the October noon. She used to eat lunch out here in the summer. She had not stopped doing it when the cold came. She opened the letter. Garrett's handwriting had always been neat, controlled, even on paper. The letter was 2 pages, front and back, and she read it twice. Once too fast, the words breaking apart before she could absorb them, and once slowly, the way you read something you are trying to find the lie inside. He had found a church, he wrote. A men's accountability group, through a pastor he'd connected with. He had been working through things, his words, for the past 1.5 years. He knew what he had done. He wanted her to know that he knew. He did not list the specific things, and she noticed that, and she did not know yet what to do with noticing it. He wrote that he was not asking to speak with her, not asking for anything except her willingness, if it ever came, to forgive him, that he understood if it didn't come, that he would not contact her again unless she chose to respond. He closed by saying he hoped she was well. I hope you have found something good. Audrey sat with the letter in her lap and looked at the gap in the tree line and the cold slice of bay beyond it. Her hands were shaking, a fine tremor she could see but not quite feel, as though her body was registering something her mind hadn't fully processed yet. Her jaw ached from clenching it. There was nausea, brief and bright, and then something else underneath the nausea that she did not have a clean name for. Not relief, not rage. Something older than both. Something that had been waiting, she suspected, for 3 years in a room she had not opened. She folded the letter back into the envelope. She looked at the bay. I hope you have found something good. She was 5 minutes late getting back inside. Owen was in the tasting room when she returned, reviewing something on the reservation tablet. He glanced up when she came through the door, and whatever he saw on her face. She thought she'd arranged it. She thought she'd had enough time in the cold air. Made him look at her a half-second too long. He didn't say anything. He went back to the tablet. It wasn't until the end of her shift, when the last guests had gone and Della was running the closing checklist in the back, that he appeared beside her at the bar, where she was logging the day's pours. She heard him before she saw him, his footsteps steady and familiar. Audrey. His voice was quiet, careful, the way it got when he was being deliberate. Are you all right? The question was so simple. It was the simplest possible question, and she felt it do something complicated in her chest. I'm fine, she said. She kept her eyes on the logbook. Long day. A pause. Okay, he said. Just that. Not disbelieving, not pushing, just receiving what she offered and not demanding more. Drive safe. She listened to him cross the room and go out the side door, and she stood at the bar for a moment after the door closed, her pen still in her hand. That night, she sat on her couch with her Bible in her lap and could not make herself open it. She tried twice. The second time, she got as far as touching the cover before her hand simply stopped. So she just held it. The apartment was quiet. The sage-green walls held the lamplight warmly around her. Outside, she could hear wind moving through the maple on the street below. Not a violent sound, just a reminder that the world was still doing what it always did, indifferent and ongoing, regardless of what was sitting in her bag in a plain white envelope. She held her Bible and sat there until the lamp felt like enough. Chapter 4. Sunday morning. North Shore Community Church did not look like much from the outside, which Audrey had always thought was exactly right. It occupied a renovated 1940s commercial building on a side street 4 blocks from the bay. Original brick exterior, tall windows that someone had replaced with clear glass instead of stained so the light came in honest and unfiltered. A hand-lettered sign above the door that said, North Shore Community Church. All are welcome. Here in letters that had weathered through enough seasons to mean it. There was no marquee with a clever saying. There was no elaborate landscaping. There was a handicap ramp that the men's group had built 2 summers ago, and a pot of bronze chrysanthemums by the front door that Carol Hartwell replanted every fall. And that was about the extent of the ornamentation. Inside was different. Inside was the kind of warm that had nothing to do with the heating system. The walls were exposed brick, and the original hardwood floors had been refinished but not replaced, so they bore the character of decades. The scuffs and variations in color that meant generations of feet had stood in these same spots. The congregation had grown to about 200 over Pastor Jim's 12 years here, a mix that Audrey found genuinely comforting in its range. Retirees who had been members since before the renovation, young families with children who occasionally escaped the nursery and made their unpredictable way down the center aisle, a contingent of 20-somethings who sat together near the back and were more engaged than they looked. A handful of people like Audrey, in the middle of their lives, carrying things they were learning to set down. She sat between Della and Becca Marsh, a 27-year-old paralegal who had attached herself to Audrey at a church potluck 8 months ago and never fully detached, which Audrey appreciated more than she'd expected. She had not slept well. The letter was in her kitchen drawer, underneath the takeout menus, which was not a permanent solution, and she knew it. But it had gotten her through Sunday morning, and she was not asking more of it than that. Pastor Jim Hartwell came to the front at 10 o'clock with the settled authority of a man who had been doing this long enough to know that rushing the beginning always cost you the ending. He was 61, broad-shouldered with reading glasses he was always setting down in places he then couldn't find them, and a laugh that came from somewhere genuine and unperformative. He had been a high school history teacher before he'd been a pastor, and it showed in the way he told a story. The patience of it, the attention to what actually happened versus what people wished had happened. Matthew 18, he said, settling his glasses on his nose and opening his Bible. Peter comes to Jesus with what he thinks is a generous offer. He says, and I imagine he was feeling pretty good about this, he says, Lord, how many times should I forgive someone who wrongs me? As many as 7 times? A few gentle laughs from the congregation. Audrey looked at her bulletin. 7 was a significant number, Pastor Jim continued. In Jewish tradition, forgiving someone 3 times was considered more than sufficient. Peter is doubling it and adding 1. He's being magnanimous. He's waiting, I think, for Jesus to say, Peter, that is an excellent and spiritually mature offer. More laughter, warmer now. Instead, Jesus says, not 7 times. The scripture tells us he said 70 times 7. Pastor Jim looked up from his Bible. Now, Jesus was not giving Peter a math problem. He was not saying keep a tally and stop at 490. He was dismantling the question, because Peter's question assumed that forgiveness was a transaction with a limit, that there was a number you could reach where you'd be released from the obligation. Jesus was saying the number is not the point. The direction is the point. Audrey wrote something on the margin of her bulletin. Then she looked at it and crossed it out. Here's what I want us to hold on to today, Pastor Jim said, leaning slightly forward the way he did when he was getting to the part that mattered. Forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. I'll say that again because I think some of us need to hear it. Forgiving someone does not mean pretending what happened didn't happen. It does not mean reopening a door that needed to be closed. It does not mean absorbing more harm in the name of grace. Those are not the same thing. He paused, letting the room be still for a moment. Forgiveness releases you. It is something that happens in your heart, by God's grace, for your freedom. What the other person does with it is between them and God. Becca nudged Audrey's arm and whispered, "He's really good today." Audrey nodded once, her eyes still forward, and did not trust herself to say more. She found Carol Hartwell in the foyer afterward, or rather, Carol Hartwell found her, which was, Audrey had observed, how most things happened with Carol. She was 63, small and unhurried, with silver hair she wore in a low knot, and a presence that made you feel, when she looked at you, that she had nowhere else to be, and nothing more important to do than be exactly here. Audrey. She said it the way she said everyone's name, like it mattered that she was saying yours specifically. She opened her arms, and Audrey walked into the hug and felt something in her shoulders release that she hadn't realized she was holding. "You look like you're carrying something heavy," Carol said, not accusatory, not alarmed, just observational, the way a person says it looks like rain. "I might be," Audrey said. Carol pulled back and looked at her with those steady eyes. "Come by this week if you want to talk. Not you should, or you need to. Just the open door, held without pressure." "I'll have coffee." Audrey nodded. She meant to say maybe, which was the word she usually reached for when she wanted to leave herself a way out. Instead, she said, "Wednesday." Carol smiled. "Wednesday." Owen was on the far side of the foyer, in the loose cluster that always formed around him after the service, partly because he was a deacon and people had things to ask him, and partly, Audrey suspected, because people were simply drawn to someone who listened the way he did. He was leaning against the brick wall, with his arms loosely crossed, talking to an older man whose name Audrey couldn't remember, and he had that quality she'd noticed before, of being fully in a conversation, not scanning the room, not managing his way through the pleasantries toward the exit. He glanced over once while she was putting on her coat. Just once. She looked away first. In the car, Becca buckled her seatbelt and turned to Audrey with the uncomplicated directness of someone whose prefrontal cortex had not yet learned the full cost of saying things out loud. "So, are you and Owen ever actually going to do something about that, or is this just going to be an ongoing situation?" "It's an ongoing situation," Audrey said, and started the car. "Because he literally—" "Becca, okay." A pause. "But he literally—" "Becca, fine." She looked out the window. "It's a very charged ongoing situation, is all I'll say." Despite everything, the drawer in her kitchen, the 2 pages of careful handwriting, the sleepless night, Audrey laughed. It surprised her, the way genuine laughter usually did, like something escaping before she could think to stop it. It lasted almost all the way home. Chapter 5. Harvest Season. The grape stomp had been Owen's mother's idea, originally. This was true of many things at Castillo Cellars, a fact Owen acknowledged freely, and Nora Castillo did not bother to deny. 22 years ago, she had suggested that the winery open its harvest weekend to the public. Let them come. Let them participate. Let them understand that wine was not a sophisticated mystery, but a living thing that began with dirt and weather and hands. Owen's father had agreed, as he generally did, when Nora had already decided. The event had sold out every year since, and people booked their October weekends around it, months in advance, and Owen still thanked his mother every year in his remarks at the closing dinner, and Nora still waved him off the same way every time, as though gratitude embarrassed her. Audrey had worked 3 grape stomps now. She knew the rhythm of the day, the way she knew the pour sequence, not just the steps, but the feel of them, the way the energy in the crowd built through the morning and crested around midday, when the actual stomping began and the adults who had been pretending to be dignified gave it up entirely. It was the best day of the winery calendar, without question. It was very nearly impossible to be unhappy at a grape stomp, which was something Audrey had tested under varying conditions and found to be consistently true. The barrels were set up in the covered pavilion behind the main barn, 6 of them deep enough to come to mid-calf on most adults. The Marquette grapes were dark and cold, and released the sharp, wild smell of real fermentation when the first feet went in. And every year, the first person to step into a barrel made a face of exaggerated shock that made everyone watching laugh. And this year, that person was a retired schoolteacher from Petoskey, who then stomped with an enthusiasm that drew sustained applause. Audrey managed the rotation list, the towel station, the grape juice samples for the children, and approximately 14 other things simultaneously, moving through the crowd with the ease that came from knowing exactly what needed doing and where. She had learned this kind of purposeful motion during the years of her marriage. How to read a room, anticipate a need, stay useful enough to stay safe. She was still untangling which parts of that skill were hers and which parts had been learned in survival. Some days the line was clearer than others. Today, she didn't think about the line at all. She saw Owen before he saw her. He had rolled his sleeves to the elbow and was standing barefoot at the edge of a barrel with a family of 4, parents in their mid-30s, 2 kids under 10, and the younger child, a girl in a striped shirt, had her arms extended straight out like an airplane for balance while she stomped, and Owen was doing the exact same thing beside her, completely straight-faced, while the parents laughed themselves to tears. Audrey stopped walking for a moment. She had known Owen Castillo for 18 months. She had observed him in the tasting room and at church and at the occasional staff gathering, and she had formed what she considered a thorough and well-evidenced picture of who he was. But she had not seen him barefoot in a barrel of grapes making airplane arms with a 6-year-old, and it turned out that added something to the picture she hadn't known was missing. He caught her eye over the child's head. The airplane arms dropped. He grinned, not his usual measured, almost smile, but a full, unguarded grin that rearranged his face entirely. And she laughed before she could stop herself. A real laugh, not the managed kind, and she looked away while the warmth of it was still moving through her. The crowd thinned as the afternoon cooled. Audrey helped Della break down the towel station, while the last few families collected their souvenir bottles and made their way to the parking area. The pavilion took on the quiet of a space that had held a lot of joy and was now settling. She was stacking the last of the folding chairs when Owen appeared beside her and took the other end of a stack without being asked. "Good day," he said. "Really good day," she agreed. They carried the stack to the equipment shed in companionable silence. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask anything of you, and Audrey had learned to notice that about him, that he didn't fill space for the sake of filling it. "Elena would have loved this one," he said as they set the chairs down. "It came out naturally, unannounced, the way you mentioned something true, because the moment calls for truth. She always said the stomp was the day the winery felt most like what it was supposed to be." Audrey looked at him. There was nothing performing in his expression. No bid for sympathy, no careful management of how it landed. Just a man saying something that was real. "She sounds like she understood this place," Audrey said. She did. He picked up the next stack. Better than I did some years. Nora Castillo found Audrey at the sink in the back kitchen 20 minutes later, washing the sample glasses in the methodical way that meant her hands were occupied while her mind went wherever it needed to go. Nora was 64, compact and capable, with Owen's same dark hair gone mostly silver, and a way of entering a room that suggested she had never in her life been uncertain of her welcome. "You're good with the crowds," Nora said, picking up a dish towel without being invited to. "You make people feel easy." "Thank you." It's not a small thing. She dried a glass with the efficiency of someone who had dried approximately 10,000 glasses in this kitchen. Owen notices that. Audrey kept her eyes on the sink. "Nora, I'm just saying what's true." She set the glass down. "I'm a very truthful person." The echo of what Della had said last Saturday was so precise that Audrey looked up sharply, and Nora's expression was perfectly innocent in a way that suggested she and Della had perhaps been coordinating, which Audrey chose not to examine too closely. She drove home in the dark, the peninsula road unwinding in her headlights, the bare cherry trees standing patient on either side. The bay was invisible now, but present. She could feel it out there in the black on both sides of the narrow land, vast and unhurried. Somewhere on the 3rd mile, she realized, with a small, quiet shock, that the letter had not crossed her mind in 6 hours. She didn't know yet whether that was healing or avoidance. But she sat with it for the rest of the drive without trying to answer the question, which felt like its own small kind of progress. Chapter 6. Beauty for Ashes. Audrey called Carol on Wednesday morning, standing at her kitchen window with her second cup of coffee, watching the maple across the street drop leaves in the October wind. She had rehearsed what she was going to say. She had planned to be concise, low-key, to frame it as a casual visit rather than what it actually was, which was something closer to a person reaching for a handhold on uncertain ground. What she said instead was, "Carol, I got a letter from my ex-husband." A brief pause, and then Carol's voice, steady and warm. "I'll put the kettle on." Carol and Jim Hartwell lived in a craftsman bungalow on a tree-lined street 8 blocks from the church, the kind of house that had clearly been lived in by people who liked living, books stacked on every horizontal surface, a porch swing that needed repainting but held a quilt and a potted fern, garden beds along the front walk that were mostly finished for the season, but still held the architectural remnants of what had apparently been an ambitious summer. The kitchen was the best room. Audrey had been here twice before for small group gatherings and had noticed it both times. The way it accumulated warmth, the way some rooms do, not from any single source, but from the accumulated evidence of use. A corkboard above the counter pinned with photos and phone numbers, and a child's crayon drawing that had to be years old. A Dutch oven on the stove that always seemed to have something in it. Mismatched mugs on open shelving, dozens of them, every one of which had clearly been chosen by someone who had a reason for it. Carol poured tea without asking what kind, and set a plate of shortbread on the table between them, and Audrey thought, not for the first time, that Carol Hartwell was the most naturally hospitable person she had ever encountered. Not in a performing way, but in the way of someone for whom welcome was simply the default setting. "Tell me," Carol said. So Audrey told her. She had said pieces of it before, to Della, in fragments, over the 18 months of their friendship, to a counselor in the first year after the divorce, in the careful, clinical language that helped you understand a thing without fully feeling it. She had said Garrett's name in sentences that described what he had done, using the terminology she'd learned: emotional abuse, coercive control, the gradual erosion of self. But she had not said it like this. All at once, to someone sitting across a kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug and her full attention given over, asking nothing except that Audrey keep going. She talked for 20 minutes, about the letter and what it said and what it didn't say. about standing on the landing with the envelope in her hand and feeling the world tilt slightly, about sitting in her car overlooking the bay and reading it twice, about the drawer in her kitchen where it was still sitting underneath the takeout menus, waiting for her to decide what to do with it. Carol listened without interrupting, without offering the small, reassuring sounds that can sometimes feel like they are more about the listener's comfort than the speaker's need. She just listened, her eyes steady. And when Audrey finally stopped talking, the kitchen was quiet for a moment, and the kettle on the stove ticked as it cooled. "How did it feel?" Carol asked. "Reading it." Audrey thought about the question honestly, like something that had been locked in a room started knocking. Carol nodded, as if that was exactly the right description. "I don't know if he's changed," Audrey continued. "I don't know if accountability groups and a new church mean what he's saying they mean. And I don't know what I'm supposed to do with any of it, whether God expects me to." She stopped, restarted. Whether forgiving him means I have to respond, or believe him, or give him anything. Carol set her mug down gently. She reached for the Bible that sat on the counter, not reaching for it in a producing a prop way, but in the way you reach for something that lives in arm's reach because you use it. And she set it on the table and turned the pages with the ease of long familiarity. "I want to read you something from Isaiah," she said. "Chapter 61. Can I just read it to you?" Audrey nodded. Carol read slowly, paraphrasing in the natural way that meant the words had long since moved from the page into her. How God's Spirit was upon his servant to bring good news to the poor in spirit, to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for those who were held captive and release for those kept in darkness, to comfort those who grieved, and to give them beauty in the place of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, a garment of praise in the place of a spirit of despair, so that they would be called oaks of righteousness, planted by God, displaying his glory. The kitchen was very quiet. "He didn't say you had to do that yourself," Carol said. She closed the Bible gently. "He said he would do it for you, the beauty instead of the ashes. That is God's work in you, not something you manufacture, not something you earn by doing forgiveness correctly." She paused. "Audrey, you have already been through the hard part. You got out. You rebuilt. You are sitting in my kitchen 3 years later, and you are a different woman than the one who left that marriage. And that is God keeping a promise, whether you've thought of it that way or not." Audrey looked at the crayon drawing on the corkboard. A house, a son, what might have been a dog. "Does forgiving him mean I have to act like it didn't happen?" she asked. The question she had been carrying since the moment she'd opened the envelope. Carol shook her head. "Forgiveness releases you. It's not a revision of history. It doesn't require you to reopen a door that needed to stay closed, or to trust someone who hasn't rebuilt that right, or to offer anything beyond what you freely choose to give." She reached across the table and touched Audrey's hand briefly. "It means you stop letting what he owes you determine the shape of your life. That's all. That's everything." Audrey breathed out slowly. Something that had been braced in her chest for days loosened by a degree. "I'm not there yet," she said. "I know," Carol said simply. "That's why you came over." She drove home along the Bay Road as the last of the afternoon light fell across the water, turning it silver and then gray. The cherry trees lined the peninsula road the way they always did, stripped to their essential shapes now, nothing left but the architecture of them, the way branches held their angle and their reach, even when there was nothing to show for it. She thought about what Carol had said. Oaks of righteousness, things planted to display his glory. She thought about a tree that goes bare before it blooms again. She drove the rest of the way home with the window cracked, letting the cold October air move through the car. And somewhere in the last mile, she realized that the locked room had gone quiet. Not because the knocking had been answered, not yet, but because she had finally told someone it was there. Chapter 7. The Fortress. Garrett called on Thursday evening. Audrey was in the middle of making dinner. Nothing ambitious, just pasta and a jar of sauce she'd been meaning to use, when her phone lit up on the counter with a number she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail. She had a rule about unknown numbers, a practical rule she'd developed in the first year after the divorce, when she was still learning to sort her instincts from her fears. The voicemail notification appeared 40 seconds later. She set down the wooden spoon. She turned the burner to low. She did not listen to it right away. She finished making dinner first, ate at her kitchen table with the phone face down beside her, looking out the window at the dark street below, where the maple moved in the wind, and a neighbor's porch light made a small, determined circle of yellow in all that black. She ate the whole bowl. She washed the dish. Then she picked up the phone and pressed play. His voice was the same. That was the thing she had not prepared for, which was foolish in retrospect. What had she thought? That contrition changed the register of a person's voice. But she had not prepared for it, and so it hit her with the full force of something unguarded. The same measured cadence, the same careful, reasonable tone. Even repentant, even changed if he was changed, he sounded like himself, and herself sounded like the person who had spent 4 years believing that voice was the most reliable thing in her world. He said he'd written the letter because he wasn't sure she'd want to hear from him directly. He said he understood if she never called back. He said the men in his accountability group had encouraged him to reach out, that making amends was part of the work he was doing, and that he wanted her to know, his words slowly, that he understood the specific things he had taken from her, and that he was sorry. He did not list them. Again. She noticed that again. The voicemail was 1 minute and 43 seconds long. She knew this because the timestamp sat at the bottom of the screen after it ended, small and precise, and she stared at it for a moment before she set the phone face down again. She lasted 6 minutes inside the apartment. She sent a quick text to Della before she pulled on her shoes, going for a run, back in a bit, then put on her heaviest fleece and her gloves and went out into the October dark. The route she took on difficult evenings went west toward the waterfront, down the hill on Boardman Avenue and along the Riverwalk, where the Boardman River met the bay at Clinch Park. At this hour and in this cold, the park was mostly empty. A man walking a dog in the far distance, the lights of the marina reflecting off water that was black and restless with the wind. The pedestrian path curved along the shoreline, and the bay opened out to the north, enormous and indifferent, its far shore just a line of distant lights that could have been any shore on any night. She ran hard for the first half mile, the kind of running that isn't really about the running. Then she slowed. Then she stopped at a bench, overlooking the water, and stood there breathing, her hands on her knees, the cold air moving through her lungs like something clarifying. She sat on the bench. The bay was very dark and very large. She could hear it shifting against the break wall, a patient, rhythmic sound, the sound of something that had been doing this for a long time and would go on doing it regardless. She pressed her palms together and bent forward slightly. Not quite a posture of prayer, just a posture of trying. God, she thought, and then couldn't find the next word for a long moment. Then it came out. Not eloquent, not composed, just the actual contents of the thing she had been carrying. I don't know how to do this. I don't know if he's changed. I don't know if I'm supposed to believe him or respond to him or what any of this is asking of me. I just know I'm tired. I'm so tired of being afraid, and I'm tired of the way his voice still does that, and I'm tired of not knowing if I can trust my own." She stopped, started again. "I just need you to be bigger than this. That's all I know how to ask right now." The wind moved off the bay, cold and direct, and somewhere in it, she felt something settle. Not an answer, not a resolution, just a fraction of the weight redistributing, as if something had heard her. There was a verse she had memorized in a women's Bible study in her second year in Traverse City. One of those passages she'd copied onto an index card and taped to her bathroom mirror until it had moved from the card into her, the way Carol's words moved from the page. "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, the one I run to when everything else gives way." Scripture called him a shield, a stronghold, the one worthy of praise, the one who saves. She had liked that verse from the first time she read it because it was not soft. A rock was not soft. A fortress was not soft. The God it described was not a gentle abstraction, but something load-bearing, something you could put actual weight on and find that it held. She said it now, not out loud, but in that interior register that felt more like remembering than speaking. My rock, my fortress, my deliverer. She sat with that for a while. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She looked at it with a spike of something sharp before she saw the name. Della. "You alive? You were supposed to text me when you got back. It's been 47 minutes. She almost cried, which surprised her. Not from sadness, from the specific relief of being known, of someone counting her minutes. She typed back, "Still at the park. Sorry, coming home now." 3 dots. Then, "I'm coming over." She typed, "You don't have to?" Della's response arrived before she finished. "I know. Leave the door unlocked." Audrey looked at the message for a moment, at the bay, at the distant lights on the far shore. She got up from the bench and walked home through the dark, and the cold air was still clarifying, and the rock was still load-bearing, and she was still afraid, but she was also, she noticed, already moving. Della arrived 20 minutes later, sat down on the couch without ceremony, and proceeded to share a string of opinions about Garrett that made Audrey laugh against her will, which was, she was certain, exactly why Della had been saving them up. Chapter 8. Perfect Love. The mistake was a small one, as mistakes went. A reservation for 6 had been entered as a reservation for 16, which Audrey discovered on Friday morning when she pulled up the afternoon bookings and found that she had, on paper, promised a tasting experience to 16 people in a room currently configured for 12. She stood at the reservation tablet for a moment, recalculated, identified the error as hers, and began quietly rearranging tables before anyone else arrived. Owen found her in the middle of it. She had moved 2 of the heavy farm tables and was working on a 3rd when she heard the side door, and she straightened and turned with the expression she used when she wanted to look like nothing was happening. "I made a booking error," she said before he could ask. Entered a 6 as a 16. "I'm fixing it." He looked at the room, at the table she'd already moved, at the configuration she was working toward. "That'll work," he said. He set down his coffee and took the other end of the table she was holding. "You don't have to." "I know," he said, and lifted his end. They moved the table in silence, then the chairs, then the small chalkboard sign that listed the afternoon's flight, which Audrey repositioned twice before it looked right. Owen watched her do it without comment, without the quality of watching that meant impatience. Just present, hands in his pockets. "I'm sorry about the error," she said. "Audrey." His voice was even, matter of fact. "It's a table configuration. It's fine." She nodded, looked at the chalkboard, looked at the room. "You're not in trouble," he said more quietly. Just that. no elaboration. She turned to look at him then, and something in his expression, the straightforwardness of it, the complete absence of anything strategic, made the back of her throat tighten unexpectedly. She looked away before he could see it. The afternoon group came and went, and by 4 o'clock, the tasting room had settled into the quiet, end-of-day rhythm that was her favorite hour at the winery. The light dropping low across the bay, the last of the guests filtering out, the satisfaction of a room that had held people well and was now at rest. She was wiping down the bar when she heard Owen's footsteps and looked up to find him coming from the back with 2 cups of coffee, which he set on the bar with the matter-of-fact manner of someone who has decided to do a thing and is doing it. He sat down on the stool across from her. She put down the cloth. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said. He wrapped both hands around his cup. "I want to be clear about that first, but I've noticed this week that something is weighing on you, and I want you to know." He paused, choosing the words with the care she recognized in him. "You don't have to be okay in front of me. That's all. I just wanted to say that out loud." The tasting room was very quiet. Through the windows, the bay held the last of the afternoon light. She looked at him for a moment. At the steadiness of him, the complete absence of agenda, and made a small decision. "I got a letter," she said, "from my ex-husband, and then a voicemail." She kept her voice level. "We didn't have a good marriage. He wasn't—" She stopped, recalibrated. He was the kind of person who does damage quietly. "And now he says he's changed, and he's asking for forgiveness, and I don't know what to do with any of it." Owen listened fully, not composing his response while she spoke, but simply receiving what she was saying. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "That's a heavy thing to be carrying around." "I'm managing." "I know you are." A pause. "That's not the same as it being easy." She looked at her coffee cup. "I'll pray for you," he said. Not as a pleasantry, not as the thing you say when you don't know what else to say. As a statement of actual intent, simple and direct. She looked up. "I mean that," he said. "I know," she said. And she did. The midweek prayer service at North Shore ran on Wednesday evenings in the fellowship hall. A smaller, quieter gathering than Sunday morning. 30 or 40 people in folding chairs arranged in a loose circle, the kind of meeting where the worship was acoustic and unhurried, and the prayers were real because the room was small enough that performance felt beside the point. Audrey went most weeks. It was the service she depended on more than Sunday mornings, if she was honest. Something about the intimacy of it, the way people said actual things in rooms that size. Pastor Jim was working through 1 John on Wednesday evenings, and he arrived at the 4th chapter with the ease of a man who had been looking forward to it. He read the passage through once, paraphrasing in his easy way, how God's love, the scripture says, is made complete in us so that we can face even the day of judgment without fear. Then the verse that followed it, the one that stopped Audrey's breath slightly, that perfect love casts out fear, because fear, the scripture explains, has to do with punishment, and those who fear are not yet fully resting in the love that has been given to them. Pastor Jim set down his Bible and looked at the circle of faces. "There are people in this room tonight," he said, "who are still living as if they are waiting to be punished for something they did, or something that was done to them." He let that land. And I want to say as plainly as I know how, that is not the life God is holding out to you. His perfect love is not a standard you perform up to. It is something He does in you, and it casts out the fear, and it breaks the punishment loop, and it says, "You are not condemned. You are not what was done to you. You are loved with a love that has no ceiling." Audrey had her hands folded in her lap. She was looking at the floor. She thought about Garrett's voice on the voicemail, the way her body had responded before her mind could intervene. The old bracing, the old shrinking. She thought about what Carol had said. You stop letting what he owes you determine the shape of your life. She thought about a love that casts out fear because it has no punishment in it. Something shifted, not dramatically. She would not have been able to point to the exact mechanism of it, but something that had been positioned defensively inside her chest moved, fractionally, into a different arrangement. She drove home slowly, the peninsula road dark and familiar around her. The bay was out there in the black on both sides, and the cherry trees stood in rows along the road, and the stars over the old Mission Peninsula were extraordinary on clear nights because there was very little light out here to compete with them. She thought about the letter in the kitchen drawer. She thought about what it would mean to respond to it. Not to call him, not to open a door, just to write back, to say the thing Carol had described. I am releasing what you owe me. Not because you've earned it. Because I am not going to let your debt determine the shape of my life. She didn't know yet if she was ready, but she noticed as she turned into her parking lot and sat for a moment with the engine off that the idea no longer felt impossible. That was different from Tuesday. That was different from Thursday night on the bench by the bay. She gathered her things and went inside, and the apartment was warm and sage green and entirely hers, and she sat down at the kitchen table with a notepad and a pen. She didn't write anything yet, but she uncapped the pen. Chapter 9. Orchard Road. She wrote the first version on Saturday night and threw it away. It was too long and too detailed, and too much of it was still arguing. Not with Garrett exactly, but with the version of herself that had believed him for 4 years, and that wasn't what the letter needed to be. She folded the pages in half and put them in the recycling bin, and sat back down at the kitchen table and looked at the blank notepad for a while. The second version was too short. 3 sentences that said nothing except that she had received his letter, which he already knew. The third version she started on Sunday after church and left unfinished on the table while she went for a run, and when she came back, she read what she had and crossed out 2 paragraphs and kept 1. She wrote the final version on Tuesday evening. It took her an hour and a half. She wrote it by hand on plain paper, not because she thought Garrett deserved the intimacy of handwriting, but because she was doing this for herself, and for herself, it needed to be handwritten, needed to have the weight of something deliberate and physical, rather than the clean erasability of a screen. She did not begin with Dear Garrett. She began with his name alone, which felt like the right amount. She wrote that she had received his letter and his voicemail. She wrote that she was not going to tell him she was fine, because he did not have the standing to receive that information, and because it was more complicated than that anyway. She did not list the specific things he had done. She noticed she was making the same choice he had made, and she sat with the symmetry of that for a moment before deciding it was right. The list belonged to God and to her counselor and to the careful interior accounting she had been doing for 3 years. It did not belong in this letter. She wrote that she had spent a long time being afraid, that his voice on the voicemail had reminded her how long and how specifically. She wrote that she was telling him this not to wound him, but because it was true, and she was done arranging the truth to make other people comfortable. Then she wrote the part she had been working up to, through all the failed versions. I don't know if you've changed. I can't know that, and you can't ask me to decide it from a letter and a voicemail. What I can tell you is that I am choosing to release what you owe me. Not because you've earned that, and not because what happened between us was acceptable, and not because I'm over it. Because I'm not. Entirely. And I expect that's honest work I'll be doing for some time yet. I'm choosing it because I have been learning, slowly and with a great deal of help, that your debt is not something I am meant to carry. I am leaving you in God's hands. That is the only place I know to put you. That makes any sense. I am not offering renewed contact. I am not saying that trust is possible or that a door is open. I am saying that I choose not to be defined by what you took from me. I am saying that I am more than that. I wish you the work of genuine change. I mean that without any edge. I'm done now. She signed it with her first name only. She read it through once. Then she folded it, put it in an envelope, addressed it to the return address from the original letter, and set it on the counter where she would see it in the morning. She read it once more on Wednesday evening and once on Thursday. She didn't change a word either time. On Friday night, she set it by her keys so she wouldn't leave without it. She slept better that night than she had in 2 weeks. Saturday arrived cold and bright, the kind of October day the peninsula saved for its best occasions. Air so clear it felt newly made, the bay running deep blue all the way to the horizon, the hills on the far shore, wearing their full autumn colors like something that knew it was being looked at. Audrey walked to the mailbox at the end of her street before her run, the envelope in her hand. She stood at the mailbox for a moment. She thought about Psalm 18, the rock, the fortress, the deliverer. She thought about Isaiah's beauty for ashes. She thought about a love that casts out fear because it contains no punishment. She lifted the handle and put the letter in and let the door close. She stood there for another few seconds, her hand resting on the cool blue metal, the maple above her releasing leaves, one at a time in the light wind. Then she went for her run. The winery closed early on Saturdays in October. The harvest events were finished, and the winter hours had begun, and by 4 o'clock the last guests were gone, and the tasting room was settling into its evening quiet. Audrey was gathering her things when Owen appeared in the doorway to the back hall. "I do a walk most evenings when we close," he said. "Just through the orchard rows. Check on things before dark." He paused. "You're welcome to come, if you want." She looked at him for a moment. He was leaning against the doorframe with his jacket on, the invitation offered without pressure or performance, just an open door, held simply, the way Carol held them. "Okay," she said. The rows ran north to south, along the slope behind the barn. Cherry trees and a newer section of Riesling vines that Owen had put in 6 years ago, the whole of it descending gently toward the eastern edge of the property, where the land dropped away and the bay appeared below. The trees were bare now, their shapes clean and unambiguous against the late sky, and the grass between the rows had gone tawny and long and moved in the wind in slow waves. They walked slowly. Owen had his hands in his jacket pockets and moved through the rows with easy familiarity, as though the land recognized him and he recognized it back. He checked a stake on one of the younger vines, made a note on his phone, kept walking. "How are you doing?" he asked. "With everything." "Better," she said. And then, because it was true, and he had earned the truth in the way quiet, careful people earn things. "I mailed a letter today. To him." Owen looked at her. "I told him I was choosing to forgive him," she said. "Not that everything was fine, not that I trusted him or that anything was open, just that I was releasing it, letting it go. How does that feel?" She considered the question honestly, the way she was learning to consider things. "Like I put something down that I'd been carrying so long, I'd stopped noticing the weight of it." She paused. "Strange. Good. Both." He nodded, his eyes on the row ahead of them, and she could see that he understood. Not just cognitively, but from somewhere that had its own experience of hard things and what came after them. They walked to the end of the row and turned, the bay visible now below the tree line, hammered silver in the late light, enormous and still. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "How do you trust someone again?" She kept her eyes on the water. "After you've been wrong before, after your own judgment has—" She searched for the word. "Failed you." Owen was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone stalling, but the quiet of someone taking a question seriously. "I think about Zephaniah," he said. "There's a verse in the 3rd chapter. The scripture says that God doesn't just tolerate his people, he delights in them, that he quiets them with his love and rejoices over them with singing." He paused. I used to read that and not quite believe it applied to me personally. After Elena, I mean. I thought, I don't know, that I was too sad or too stuck, or that I'd somehow used up whatever portion of good things I was allotted. He glanced at her sideways. "It took me a long time to actually believe that God rejoices over me, that I wasn't just tolerated, that good things were genuinely meant for me, not just for people who had their lives more together than I did." The wind moved through the bare cherry trees, a soft sound, almost musical. "So how does that answer the question?" she asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. "Because if that's true," he said, "if he actually delights in us, then the good things that come are real. They're not traps. They're not mistakes." He stopped walking and turned to look at her, and his expression was the most open, the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Nothing managed in it, nothing held back. Just Owen, standing in his own orchard in the last light, saying something true. "I think you trust again by starting to believe that you deserve the good things that are meant for you. And then testing it slowly, with people who've earned it." She looked at him. "I've been patient," he said. "I want to be clear that I'm aware I've been very patient." The corner of his mouth moved. "But I'd like to have dinner with you sometime. Not as colleagues, not as church friends." He paused. "As whatever this is, if you're willing to find out." The bay was silver below them. The cherry trees stood bare in their rows. The sky was doing something extraordinary with the last of the light, the way October sky did when it was really trying. She thought about the letter in the mailbox. She thought about the pen she had uncapped. She thought about the rock and the fortress and the love that contained no punishment. And she thought about a woman who had put down a weight she'd carried so long she'd stopped noticing it, and she thought about what Carol had said. That is God keeping a promise. "Yes," she said. Just yes. It was enough. Chapter 10. The Harvest Table. The table ran 40 feet long. That was not an exaggeration. Owen's father had built it in sections 20 years ago from reclaimed barnwood, the same wood that had become the tasting room bar, and when the harvest dinner came around each October, it was carried out in pieces and assembled along the slope behind the barn, oriented so that every seat had a sightline to the bay. String lights were hung between the old cherry trees on either side, and by the time the sun went down and the fire pits were lit at each end, the whole arrangement had a quality that made people go quiet for a moment when they first saw it. The way the tasting room windows made them go quiet, the way the peninsula itself had a habit of doing if you let it. Audrey had helped set up the table every year she'd worked here. This year it felt different. She couldn't have said exactly when the shift had happened, whether it was the letter in the mailbox or the walk through the orchard rows, or something that had been accumulating in small increments over 18 months without her knowing it was accumulating. But she was aware, carrying out the centerpieces with Della in the early evening light, that she was not performing ease tonight. She was simply at ease. There was a difference, and she had learned it slowly enough that she could recognize it now. Della noticed within approximately 4 minutes. She appeared at Audrey's elbow while they were arranging the last of the candles, studied her face with the frank appraisal of a person who knew that face very well, and said, "You look different." "Different how?" "Like you're actually here." Della tilted her head. "You're always here, but tonight, you're here." She tapped her own sternum for emphasis. Audrey smiled. "I feel different." Della's expression shifted to something warm and slightly relieved, the look of a person who has been quietly hoping for something for a long time and is only now allowing herself to believe it's arrived. She put her arm around Audrey's shoulders and squeezed once, firmly, and then picked up the next candle without making a production of it, which was the most Della way of handling an emotional moment that Audrey could imagine. "Is this about the letter?" Della asked. "Partly. Is it about a certain person who owns this vineyard and has been very patient?" Della. "Also partly then." She set the candle down with great satisfaction. "Good. I've been waiting a long time for partly." Nora Castillo was at the far end of the table, directing the placement of the bread baskets with the authority of someone who had run this dinner since before half the guests were born, which was accurate. She caught Audrey's eye across the length of the table and smiled. Not the polite smile of an employer's mother, but the smile of a woman who knew something and was glad about it. Audrey smiled back. She thought about what Owen had said in the orchard. Good things are genuinely meant for you. She was trying it on. She was finding that it fit better than she'd expected. The guests arrived as the last daylight left the sky. Staff and their families, the Hartwells, Becca, half a dozen of the winery's longtime suppliers and neighbors who had become, over the years, something closer to community. The fire pits threw warm, unsteady light across the faces around the table, and the string lights made everything amber and small and close, and someone had brought a speaker that played quietly enough to talk over. Owen moved through the gathering the way he always did, present, genuinely glad to see each person. Audrey watched him greet Pastor Jim and Carol, shake hands with old Mr. Trevino from the cherry orchard 3 properties down, crouch to say hello to one of the Hartwell grandchildren who had made a determined break from the kids' end of the table. He was good at this, she thought. Not in a practiced way, in the way of someone for whom other people were genuinely interesting. He made his way to her eventually, with 2 glasses of the late harvest Riesling. He handed her one without ceremony and stood beside her at the edge of the firelight. "You okay?" he said quietly. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true and the evening was beautiful and she was done being stingy with true things, really okay, not fine okay, actually okay. He looked at her with that honest, open expression that was simply his face when he wasn't managing anything. "Good," he said. They stood together while the table filled and the voices rose around them, and it meant something. The standing together, the not needing to fill it. And she let it mean something, which was new, which was the whole point. Pastor Jim stood when everyone had found their seats, and the table went quiet in the gradual, natural way of people who are comfortable with each other and willing to be still. "Lord," he said, and his voice carried easily in the open air. "We're grateful tonight for this table and the work that built it, and for the people around it who have shown up for each other through seasons that weren't always easy." He paused. "You told us through the prophet Isaiah that you would give beauty for ashes and oil of gladness for mourning, and a garment of praise in the place of a spirit of despair. And Lord, I look around this table and I see the evidence of that promise kept. Thank you for the harvest. Thank you for what you're still growing. Amen." A chorus of amens around the table. The bread began to move. The voices rose again. Audrey sat with the words for a moment, whether or not Pastor Jim knew how squarely they landed, before she reached for her glass. Beauty for ashes. What you're still growing. She felt Owen's hand settle briefly over hers on the table. A question, not a claim. And she turned her hand and held it, and that was answer enough. After dinner, when the plates had been cleared and the fire pits had burned low, and the conversation had mellowed into the easy, unstructured kind that meant no one wanted to be the first to leave, Owen touched her elbow and tilted his head toward the far edge of the property. They walked together through the dark to where the land ended and the bay appeared below, vast and black, and lit across its surface by a half-moon that had come up while they weren't watching. The lights of Traverse City curved along the far shore, and beyond them the water went on until you couldn't tell where it ended and the sky began. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She was learning to inhabit silence rather than escape it. Then she said, almost to herself, "I think I might actually be okay." Owen stood beside her with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the water. "I know," he said. "A beat. I've been watching you get there." She looked at him in the dark, at this careful, steady man who had offered her a hand without demanding she take it, who had prayed for her and meant it, who had stood in an orchard and said true things without asking anything back. "Thank you for waiting," she said. "It wasn't hard," he said. "You were worth it." She looked out over the water for a long moment, over the dark rows of bare cherry trees, waiting for another season, over the silver path the moon made across the bay, over all the quiet evidence of a world that kept going and kept offering and kept making things new. The fear was not entirely gone. She suspected it would ask for her attention again, in smaller ways, in the ordinary course of being a person who had been through something, but it was no longer the largest thing in the room. She was. She stood at the edge of the land with the cold air off the bay and the warmth of the man beside her and the words of the blessing still sitting somewhere in her chest. Beauty for ashes, what you're still growing. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not afraid of what came next. She was, in fact, looking forward to it. Thank you for spending some time with us, listening, reflecting, and resting in God's endless love. If this story touched you, encouraged you, or brought a moment of peace, I'd be so grateful if you'd leave a like. It helps our uplifting stories reach more hearts. If you'd like to join us for more grace-filled tales, please subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. Until we meet again in the next story, may you carry His grace with you, one gentle step at a time. Simply Grace Audio. Simple stories, endless grace.